We're so glad to have journeyed with you until now for our finishing chapter and conclusion. Chapter 8, Democracy, Not Authoritarianism, is the Presbyterian way. And this chapter is probably one of the more alarming ones for folks about what's going on around us, particularly around questions of Christian nationalism, the challenges of an authoritarian kind of regime, and how do we understand what our faith teaches us about how both to understand what's going on, but also ways in which to resist what's going on. So I think most people don't know that Presbyterians generally have in their DNA a rejection of any form of authoritarianism. And it's in our DNA in part because we are suspicious of anyone who claims power or authority, because we know all human beings fall short of God's call to compassion and peace and justice. But we also know that it is only by grace that folks know God's love and grace, peace and justice. So we as a denomination have always had struggle with authoritarian tendencies we see around us, from Scotland to Switzerland to around the world. And part of our DNA is our theology, but also our polity, in which we do things decently and in order and are structured around concepts of democracy and commitment to democratic principles. So this is a pertinent question for Presbyterians because we so outright reject authoritarian principles.
And as you say, the rise of authoritarianism is not something that is as fresh as a spring garden.
Right.
There's a history of this that goes back to Pharaoh and Egypt, and to any time when one people feel like that their perspective frees them, allows them, sanctions them to repress other people. And so they're the common phrases that are used today that are rooted in the past, like colonialization, where there is an empire co-opting the land, the tradition, the culture, the lives of other people for the empire's own purposes. And the book of Revelation is but one example of people who feel the oppression. I mean, some people say, well, it's about the end of time. Well, it is also about people struggling with the pressures of society and culture as they felt that Rome threatened them, their autonomy, their freedom.
So I often have folks ask me, and folks within the church and outside the church, who wonder, do Presbyterians get too political? Because we have a long history of engaging in challenging authoritarian regimes, including the very start of the American Revolution. And you look at Presbyterian history around the American Revolution, you can see that's always been, again, our suspicion. It's in our DNA. Challenge authoritarianism. But so I have folks who ask me, is being Presbyterian too political? And I articulate it in that, and I try to make a distinction between being partisan and being political. But I argue, no, that Presbyterians are being biblical. They are rooting their life in Scripture, in which to say Jesus Christ is Lord was a challenge to Caesar, to Pharaoh. And if we truly believe, the only question you're asked to join the Presbyterian Church is the question, is Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior? Right?
Right, and not Caesar somewhere,
and
somehow.
Jesus, right. Whatever Caesar might look like, or whoever might claim to be Caesar. That the statement, Jesus is Lord, is as biblical and political as you could get. Now, let's confess our own shady history, particularly when we were part of the mainline denomination. We were one of the mainline stronger denominations, and we've had a we've kind of married sometimes with our commitments to the country, the number of flags in our sanctuaries. We are having significant conversations about, is that going too far? Is that being political?
Right, and one part of this that I want to argue about too political is maybe the only the use of the word too, T-O-O.
Right.
That it is political to be a citizen, and if we take that God is sovereign over all the realm,
Right.
the universe, then our allegiance is to God, number one, not in a way that says to me I have license to run over somebody else or to spear them if they don't agree with me.
Right.
But that citizenship is in fact a form of stewardship. We are called to be stewards of our citizenship, which is, in our democratic tradition as Presbyterians, it is a call from God to identify our citizenship with the equal good of the neighbor. And so if you go back even back to Europe, as you talked about, John Calvin ran for his life from the King of France, because even though he was a Roman Catholic at the time, his political opinions were too democratic for the king. Mm-hmm. And when he got to Switzerland, he was still had to struggle with being a refugee, we might even say today a green card holder, forming an immigrant community with a voting empowerment and political involvement. And then John Knox went through the same struggles in Scotland, and John Witherspoon came from Scotland, having been in the tradition of John Knox, to the United States, to Princeton at the time of the Revolutionary War. Was
the only minister to
along.
sign the Declaration of Independence who was a Presbyterian minister. So
it
is in our DNA.
They all believed that we are citizen stewards of a greater realm.
And as far as, and I've always been puzzled, and particularly as we've talked about this whole book, in the sense of understanding that God is grace, the sense of community, the sense of discipleship is a lifelong conversation, the movement of God. God is sovereign and providential, and God is at work in the world, and we participate in that.
And we live into God's future for the good of all.
Right, for the good of all. And so often I find this frustrating, that those who claim, and they tend to be Dysvangelicalism, that we need to be a Christian nation. And the very definition, and maybe this gets at the heart of the book, who defines what Christian means? That was the tension at the very beginning among some members of the congregation I serve, and people I meet, young and older. I can't call myself Christian because they're defining Christian this.
But in the early church, they asked the same question: who defines what is Christian?
Right.
And the day was finally brought to persuasion from those who said, well, God defines who are God's people.
Well, and when they use the term Christian nationalism, they're defining Christians. Well, we have the 10 Commandments in classrooms. We have every kid has a Bible. We say certain words in our Pledge of Allegiance and in our songs, and that is not Christian. The biblical Christian, if we wanted to go there, is that we'd have a society in which no one goes hungry. If you wanted to call it a Christian nation, really, it would be a society in which the immigrant is welcomed. We would be a country that isn't the number one exporter of military weapons in the world. How can you call that Christian? It's against the very Bible and evangelical impulse of the Presbyterian Church.
Well, against part of the Ten Commandments too, but we don't, thou shalt not kill. But apart from even, I don't think you can take it apart from foreign policy, but I do think that each individual, each church, each community of faith needs to be having these conversations. Right. I've served churches where they would put the American flag out every Sunday and leave it out, and woe be unto the person that moved it. That was probably more a form of nationalistic tendencies, the nation as much as God. I've been in other churches where the leadership agreed, well, we're going to bring the flag out on near national holidays because it does remind us of our stewardship as citizens.
In a thoughtful, ordered conversation around all of this.
Right. And
which is very Presbyterian.
Yes, yeah. And so, in fact, we'd have to put it on the calendar. A flag comes out this day so that no one forgot. Because if somebody forgot, somebody took offense.
Right.
You didn't honor the agreement.
Right.
Yeah. And if it was out too long after a Sunday of a national holiday, then somebody else took offense. So, but all those are really good feelings to have in a community with diversity.
That's willing to wrestle with those questions.
Yes.
And willing to allow truth to emerge over time. And willing to allow our own biases to be challenged. I truly believe, and now we've written particularly this third book, I am struck and truly believe, because I've been a lifelong Presbyterian, as have you, that the Presbyterian voice is vitally important right now. The Presbyterian theological vision, even though we may be smaller, even though we may not have political power, the Presbyterian vision of reality in God is vitally important to speak to the moment that exists right now.
And through our citizenship, which is a faithful outgrowth of God's gifting, we can be better day by day for all of our faults and fallacies.
So, and we did this on purpose. We named the title of the conclusion of the book, and I think I want a T-shirt that says this: "Grace is our resistance," and that sounds odd because grace seems such a small thing. Grace seems, in the face of the huge authoritarian, mean-spirited, militaristic kinds of things that exist in the world, and grace seems like this tiny thing. But yet it's what Jesus embodied. It's what transformed ultimately the Roman Empire. And it is our resistance. It is to believe in grace, to extend compassion to even those we disagree with, most especially to those we disagree with, to care as much about them as we do our own kinds of things, is a radical way of living in the world. We just need to embrace that.
Well, and we never know how God is going to show up, bring about involvement, bring alive grace. I think about the small city where I served a year as an interim pastor in Sherman, Texas. And Sherman, Texas was one of the last public lynchings in the state of Texas in 1931. But then in the 1950s, a young man came to school there at Austin College, a Presbyterian school, came from the Texas Pan American School, which is a preparatory high school for international students, mostly Hispanic, in Kingsville, Texas, run by the Presbyterians, because he was born in northern Mexico. Came to Texas Pan American School for the beginning of his secondary education, went to Austin College in Sherman, went to Austin Seminary, then went to Princeton Seminary. In 1967, Jorge Lara Brown spoke at the Global Missions Conference at Montreat, North Carolina, for the Southern Presbyterian Church. And he spoke about a kind of nationalism that would bring about a change. And of course, 1967 was a time when the Vietnam War was going on. The civil rights unrest was rampant and would only get worse going into 1968. But in 1967, he told that audience at the Global Missions Conference that our role was not to be an imperial role with our mission work. It was not to create colonies of U.S. Presbyterian-like people in other places. It was to listen and to support the work of people on the ground in other nations with a clear sense that we ourselves were born of the hopes and dreams of the common people, that Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Witherspoon, that they spoke about human rights. While they were not all Presbyterians, they had a sense that we have stewardship of citizenship that has to do with the dignity of all people. And he said we need a revival, but we need a revival not only of the Christian faith as we might best understand it, but that will always create and be part of a revival of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And he said, don't think for a minute that people in Central American countries and in South American countries, in the global South, that they don't look to the United States to see if there is a congruity in what the United States espouses and what it practices. And he said, so long as people of Asian, Hispanic, and African American backgrounds are treated as second-class citizens, the United States should not and will not have credibility in other countries. I wonder how that word, how hard it might have been for the audience to hear that word in 1967.
But he was, grace extended is resistance.
And he had experienced being brought up. The grace of the Presbyterian Church gave him an education that he valued, but he also felt in his integrity that he was duty bound to speak the truth of the gospel of grace.
So I went, I think it's now about 2 years ago in February. I was part of a delegation, one of the few after the terrorism that happened in Israel in October. In Gaza, right. They killed thousands of Israeli people. And we went as a delegation to kind of connect and listen and be present to those who were suffering, which included visiting with a father whose son had been taken and was a hostage, an Israeli father. But it was also engaging in listening to the stories, and the Palestinian people would tell stories of their experience in what's going on in that country. The horrific injustices that they experience each and every day, from their homes being torn down, to arrests without warrants, to their isolation in corridors where they're unable to travel. So it was, I will tell you, it was not an easy trip. And actually caused much angst and sadness. And that doesn't even capture it, to hear these stories and to know what is happening and the stuckness that is there. And one particular place we went to visit was a basement of a rec center in one of the
Of a recreation center?
Yeah, a recreation center in one of the Palestinian areas. And we sat and listened to men and mothers and grandmothers talk about arrests and being taken to prisons and not knowing where their loved ones are, overcrowded prisons without any charge, just this horrific injustices that's happening to them. And it's just horrible to listen to. It's just hard to carry those challenging what's going on in the world in places that you cannot imagine. And but as we're listening to those folks, as we're doing that, I hear music from upstairs in the rec center. I think we all start hearing. And when we finish with them, we all start gravitating to go upstairs. And when we get upstairs, there are these Palestinian youth who are dancing to traditional music. And it's beautiful, and it's joyful, and it's a gift, a grace. Because, and I remember one young woman especially, how passionate she was dancing. And because Palestinians say our lives are our resistance. To be alive is to resist. And I remember this, to me, that image of that young Palestinian woman dancing, even in the midst of the horrific things that were happening at the time, it was a great message of grace. The grace is our resistance as well. So,
not simply halfway around the world,
right,
but right here.
The world needs a Presbyterian church that embodies the good news.
And so, whether one is a Presbyterian or not, as we have said
right.
multiple times, being embraced by grace means, we can always say our definitions are always going to be limited, but it means being embraced by God's love for the living of love with all of God's people.
Right.
And that will take us beyond dysvangelicalism.
Right.
It will take us to a reclaiming of God's gift of grace.
Thank y'all for joining with us.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing about your conversations with each other and with other people you encounter about this great gift of grace.
Right.